I volunteer for a nonprofit organization that has virtually no money. Many of the grants we see require a cash match. If we have no money for a match, how can we apply for grants? Which is a good and common question. So, my first piece of advice is to get creative. And part of what I mean by that is while you may not have cash lying around to do a match, you do still have access to cash usually in a couple different areas. And so one of those areas might be in your donor and community. So, for example, if you have a donor that tends to donate $1,000 annually to your organization, tying that donor's donation to your project can sometimes be used as that cash match. Some of the granting agencies do require the money come from the organization itself, but not always, or there's, ways that accounting wise, technically the donor's money goes to your organization and is your organization's money. So anyway, working with those networks and money that may exist sort of adjacent to your organization and using those as your cash match. Another way that we can sometimes do this is the operational resources you're putting towards the grant project counts. So for example, if you're working on a digitization project and you're working in a collections management system that has an annual licensing fee, if you're using up to a quarter of the storage for this new project, then a quarter of whatever that annual licensing fee can sometimes be used as a cash or in-kind match, depending on how strict they are about cash. In terms of, okay, yes, the museum in this case is covering the collections management system, and we can, write off a quarter of it for this project. Another thing to think about is pairing grants, and this does get a little more complicated and is only something I recommend for people who are regularly writing grants or it has already had some success writing grants. And what I mean by pairing grants is if you're chunking your project out into phases, applying for grants that could help fund one of those phases and timing it out in a way where, okay, I'm going after this grant to do a collection assessment. And then after that, based on the assessment, I'm going after this grant to implement the recommendations. And so when you're writing to those grants, while you don't have the cash in hand, you can at least point to and acknowledge, I have written to these grants. We hope to use these for the second piece of the project or the first piece of the project. That is a little tenuous, but there are some strategic ways we can go about it. For example, one of the foundations that I worked with, I actually reached out to ahead of the application and said, look, we're applying for this grant over here. We'll know the decision by this date. If we get it, do you commit to funding our second phase of the project? Explaining that, hey, grant one wants a cash match. Your foundation also requires a cash match. Can we pair these grants together and actually be able to do this? And so it does take some conversation. It does take some finagling. Obviously, it depends on you getting both of those grants, but there are ways to do it. So putting those in place, if you've had experience in doing so, it's worth trying. Another thing to think about is some offer in-kind matches. So cash match usually means they want cash that your organization is putting up. But there's some leniency depending on the grant you're applying for in terms of if it also includes some in-kind match. Different organizations classify these differently, but one example that I usually see that is also considered a cash match is when a certain staff's percentage of FTE that they would be working on this project for can count towards the organization pays that person's portion of that FTE, and therefore that organization's putting the cash up for it. Another thing to think about is for in the instances where we're trying to set up archives or collection organizations, if we're trying to increase our capacity of what we're doing, if we're trying to get a grant to help fund and acquire equipment or something, that training, anything that helps us do our job better and more efficiently, or perhaps expand the job we're doing, those all sort of revolve around what granting agencies consider capacity building. And there are grants out there, especially at the federal level, that have things called organizational capacity grants or capacity building grants. And those are ones that I recommend you look into if you're looking at starting at the beginning, trying to get some programs going, needing that help building your capacity. There is actually a whole category out there that is specific to capacity building.